Welcome back. 412-575-2600 is the number on the Bordas and Bordas hotline. Plus, taking your tweets at Josh Taylor HD. Let's go straight to the phone lines. We got Dave in DuBois. Dave, you're on the Nightly Sports Call.
Hey, how you doing, Josh? You doing
Good. How
a
are you?
great job.
Appreciate
Good,
you.
thanks. I was calling to find out what your opinion on James Franklin is. After watching the Penn State-Memphis game today, a lot of people on Twitter blasting Franklin for some of the in-game decisions he makes. I realize sometimes he's not the greatest in-game coach. They got the new offensive coordinator coming in from Minnesota, but maybe I don't know if you think he's a top 10 coach. I'd just like to know your thoughts.
Appreciate the call. Hey, this is a good question because I get this question a lot when it comes to James Franklin. And I don't think the criticism is necessarily unfair. If you go back the past couple seasons, I think back to the game against Ohio State when they had a fourth down to keep their hopes alive and they called a play call that just completely fell apart at the end of the game. So there's a couple in-the-game decisions that you look at from James Franklin and you do question them and you wonder just how much of his prowess of an in-game coach could be improved upon, so to speak. However, the one thing I will say about James Franklin is that he's a great recruiter. And the one thing we've picked up, a lot of times in college football, if you want to look around the game and try to find examples, you can. But for the most part, most coaches in college football, they're either really good in-game coaches or they're really good recruiters. The very few that do both, they're the ones at the top of the ladder. But most of them, for the most part, they're either strong recruiters that bring in good coordinators that are good in-game decision guys, or they're good X's and O's guys, and they bring in the guys that recruit. Now, which one works, which side of the coin tends to work, that's a bit of a different discussion. But I put James Franklin in that group of guys who are really good recruiters and maybe not as strong X's and O's guys. And maybe that leads to why there seems to be some changes here and there. But they're bringing in a new offensive coordinator. I like that move, actually, bringing in Shiraka. I think that's actually a good move because it's one of those if you can't beat them, join them type of things. And Minnesota was an offense that gave them a lot of problems. So obviously, you bring in the guy that found the flaws in your team and maybe he can figure them out in other teams. So I don't mind that move as far as James Franklin's concerned in finding a coordinator. But, yeah, as far as in-game decisions are concerned, they are iffy. I think that's one of the reputations that might have followed him from Vanderbilt, and it might have manifested itself here in the last couple of years. But at the same time, here's the thing you got to look at. 11 wins in 3 out of 4 seasons. That's hard to argue with. That's still pretty good. We have Joe from Plum on the line. Joe, you're on the Nightly Sports Call.
Hey, Josh, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Hey, have you heard anything about Sidney Crosby on his condition?
Actually, we had a question about this last night. Mike Sullivan actually talked about it at one point, and he said Sidney Crosby is making some progress. Now, granted, he's not to the point where he's skating with the team and doing things like that, but he has started to make some progress and working his way back. I don't think they have that kind of timetable yet to when he might be able to get to that point. They're still trying to work their way through, but he's coming back from a sports hernia, so it's not like they're that much far more advanced in the process. But according to Mike Sullivan, he is making progress. Of course, that seems like the most vague of descriptions. But if you've ever heard Mike Sullivan give updates on players, they tend to be pretty vague, especially early in the process. Usually he starts to open up a little bit more when they get closer to the end. Like Patrick Hornquist, for instance. A couple days ago, he was talking about, or yesterday he was talking about Patrick Hornquist was starting to come around and actually getting closer to being put on the ice. And then you turn around today, he's off IR, and he's on the ice tonight. So that's the difference. Let's keep rolling. We'll go to Twitter. We have Mike on Twitter who asks, do you think the Steelers will be looking for a quarterback in the draft or other pressing needs? That's a good question. I don't know if they can figure that out as far as pressing needs in the draft until after they get into the league year because they're going to have to make some difficult decisions. They got to figure out what they're going to do as far as Bud Dupree because his contract's coming up. You got to figure out what to do with Javon Hargrave. You got to figure out what to do with Mike Hilton. If I had to guess, the easiest guy to sign probably in that group is probably Javon Hargrave. Probably easier to get him under contract. The second easiest guy might be Mike Hilton. The tough guy to figure out, you got to figure out what you're going to do with Bud Dupree. Is someone going to outbid them for Bud Dupree? Or are you going to get into a situation where you might get a little bit uncomfortable going up against that cap? However, they're going to have a little bit more room because I do believe the cap goes up significantly next year. So there are some things, some leeway that they can work their way around and try to figure some things out. Now, if they do those things, let's say for the sake of argument, they do bring back Javon Hargrave and Mike Hilton. Those are two positions you probably don't have as big of a need for. You don't have to worry about defensive back. You don't have to worry about defensive line. I'm worried about offensive line. I'm worried about wide receiver. And quarterback might be on my list of things that I'm looking at, probably in the mid to later rounds. Am I looking for a franchise guy tomorrow? No, but I am looking at quarterback because depth has definitely become an issue with this team. Let's go back to the phone lines. Gordon and Dormont. Gordon, you're the Nightly Sports Call.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up the Steeler quarterbacking situation. Should it have occurred to anybody on the Steeler coaching staff or in the front office sometime, maybe before the season started, what do we do if Ben gets injured and has to miss a significant part of the season? We don't have anybody behind him with any significant experience starting in the National Football League. We have got a couple rookies. You know, how are we going to cope with a situation if Ben has to miss a month of the season or 6 weeks of the season? We don't have a Charlie Batch to come in to fill in who's capable. We don't have anybody. We got Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges, and neither of them, you know, has any real experience starting in the National Football League. You would have thought that the thought would have occurred to somebody, maybe we need to get somebody in there who's a veteran.
I get your point, Gordon, and thanks for the call.
Around.
I understand. I understand the point. Thanks for the call. That's a great question to ask in December. And honestly, the bigger thing would have been, did they trade Josh Dobbs too soon? That's probably the question we should be asking ourselves. Because remember, Josh Dobbs was a part of this team until after training camp ended, and then they traded him to Jacksonville. So that's the other thing. It's not necessarily did they think of what happens if Ben gets injured. I wonder what the thinking is. Did they really think Mason Rudolph was that much better than Josh Dobbs, that they thought it was worth keeping him over Josh Dobbs and sending Josh Dobbs to Jacksonville, even though Josh Dobbs was older and had more experience? I think that's the question that we ask ourselves. And if that is the question, it sounds like the answer was they had more faith in Mason Rudolph, or they thought that they can get some kind of value out of Josh Dobbs. And they did get a draft pick in return, but was that value enough for maybe what you gave up an opportunity cost? Maybe I'm being a little bit too economic professor-ish, but that's probably the way you look at that in hindsight. Because if I look at it as just as simple as what do you do if Ben gets hurt, then we're ignoring the fact that they had Josh Dobbs and shipped him off. They had an option, and they decided to do something else with it. So that's the thing that it comes back to for me. Got to take a break. We'll take more phone calls and tweets when we come back. Stick around.
Portions of this program sponsored by FanDuel Sportsbook.